Summer of 1963, Integrating Alabama's Schools. Sponsored by Alpha Insurance and SPLC Civil Rights Memorial Center.
The Attorney General on 9-0.
All right, stay on.
Yes, sir.
Oh, Mr. President?
Yes, sir.
We are apt to have some problems in Alabama based on the actions of the governor over the last few days.
I still intend to resist integration as governor of this sovereign state. And I feel that the events that have transpired in Mississippi ought to inform that crowd in Washington that the people in this section don't like to have this forced upon them, and maybe they ought to cool off up there and let us live in peace a while. But no, sir, I intend to continue to resist any integration attempt here in Alabama.
First, you have to appreciate it's been 9 years since the Supreme Court handed down Brown versus Board of Education, and in Alabama, not one single black student had gone to school with a white student. What you had during that time is massive resistance, and that was certainly evident in Macon County. Schools are completely segregated, and they're poised for a fight to continue to maintain it that way.
10 years had almost expired, and nothing had been done toward desegregating schools throughout most of the South and none in Alabama.
There was an enforcement element in Brown, too, that accelerated the pace, but there was nothing really punitive involved. I believe the Supreme Court expected goodwill on the part of the South, and it just did not happen.
They had this big push in the 60s throughout the South to try to get schools desegregated.
We have viewed with dismay the tragically slow pace of the Negro's progress toward full emancipation in the state of Alabama. Thusly, we suffer the indignity of being politically and economically exploited. We travel the highways of our state without the bare human comfort of adequate food and lodging. We have been cheated and robbed in public education, and Jim Crow health services skyrocket our mortality rate.
We got the best education in Tuskegee, but the schools were not equal. Principals would come around to different churches pleading for money to buy things like, paper towels, toilet paper, and things like that. Whereas, the school system and education is based on property tax. We all pay property tax to a certain extent, but we were not getting our fair share of that in the school system, in the black school systems. So that's why this suit was started.
Lawsuit was began, Lee versus Board of Education for Macon County, and my parents, through their affiliation with the Tuskegee Civic Association, put my name in the hopper, so to speak, and it fell out. And they came to me after it was all said and done that I was one of the chosen kids to integrate the public schools of Macon County.
We filed the typical type case you file to get schools desegregated, and that is you allege that that Brown versus Board of Education declared that segregated schools are unconstitutional, and based on that, you would prepare a complaint, ask the court to set a preliminary injunction so you'd be able to get an early hearing. On that hearing, you'll ask the court to enter an order declaring that the school system that was segregated was unconstitutional, and asking that an injunction be issued against the school board and its members, and demand them to come up with a plan to desegregate the schools in their system. Now, what you have to remember in Alabama, theoretically, you had, at this time, about 119 school systems. You had to go and file a suit against each of these school boards. Well, we filed the suit and had a hearing. It was Judge Frank M. Johnson, who was the only federal district judge in the Middle District at that time.
I think what's key about Levy-Macon and Fred Gray filing that particular case is that it's in the Middle District of Alabama, which means it came before Judge Frank Johnson. And Judge Johnson, more than any other jurist probably in the Deep South at that time, was establishing himself as really intolerant of any kind of chicanery or foolishness when it came to constitutional rights. And so it was key that Attorney Gray filed that case at that time in his Middle District Court.
You can see the mindset of Judge Johnson on display. He believed in the Constitution, and he believed that the Constitution was colorblind.
I think we finally, after the suit was filed, which was in January of '63, we had several hearings, and I think in July of '63, Judge Johnson designated the United States government as a party plaintiff in the lawsuit. And that's what he did in most of these cases, because if he entered an order, he recognized that it would be opposition to it, but he wanted to be sure that the order was carried out.
Every school system in the state that was not already subject to a court order was brought under the Levy-Macon umbrella. That eliminates the need for 99 other sets of plaintiffs, 99 other sets of families that have to go through the process of being test cases and enduring intimidation and potential violence.
The community had prepared itself, and while I don't think the white people in the community, at least some of them, and probably the majority of them, may not have wanted the schools desegregated, but they realized it's the law of the land. So the community had worked very hard. And Allen Parker, who was president of the Alabama Exchange Bank, a white person, but one who was well respected by both white and blacks as being fair, he and others in the community had worked hard to get things ready so that schools could be appropriately desegregated.
Even coming up to going to school that year, we'd had meetings with different people for there to be a smooth transition. Lo and behold, on that first day of school, unbeknown to all of us, when we got to the school, the state troopers were surrounding the school, and they would not let us in that first day.
Going back to September, there was an integration audit of a high school in Tuskegee, and it was all proceeding satisfactorily. They have a good head of Bureau of Education in that county, a fellow by the name of Pruitt, who used to play football at the University of Alabama. And it was all proceeding satisfactorily, and all the kids were going to school. And then, as you remember, the governor raised such a fuss and sent the troopers in and scared everybody off.
We got over to the school. Captain Pryor of the Alabama State Patrol got on the bus and read a proclamation from Governor George Wallace that basically said, "You guys are breaking the law. You cannot integrate this school." And said to the bus driver, "Take them back." And the bus driver took us back over to the superintendent's office, and our parents loaded us up in our cars, and we went back home.
At Tuskegee Public is a more or less immediate exodus of white students from the school. They knew that this was happening. It was a court order. There was nothing that could be done evidently by that point, and so their response was to simply leave. And some of them never showed up that morning, the white students. Some of them left over the course of the day. There are students who have written memoirs looking back and said, "I remember being in class, and it should have been a normal day, but it very obviously wasn't. Our teacher had on sunglasses, ostensibly she'd been crying, and then in the middle class, a black student is ushered into the classroom, and no one says a word, but that particular student, looking back, said, I got called into the principal's office later, and my father had called in and said I should come home. And he said, I knew I would never set foot in that school again, and he didn't.
I've had enemies of mine that go all over this state and say, George Wallace is too strong for segregation. Now, how in the name of common sense can you be too strong for it? You're either for it or against it. There's not in the middle ground. And I want to tell you this, that I am unalterably opposed to any mixing in the public schools of Alabama, and I believe if we got the insides to stand up on the plan I told you in the first primary, we can win. All it takes is some insides and some intelligence, and I tell you what, and some standing up and letting them know we mean what we say, and we can win that fight.
If the governor had the power to prevent, and that power is given to him under the Constitution and laws of the state of Alabama, to prevent integration, then that same Constitution, we could have him, if we get a court order directing him not to interfere with the desegregation of schools, then we could have the governor not only to be ordered to not interfere with the schools in Macon County, but even looking further ahead, if he could do it for one county, he could do it for all 119 counties. So we said, ultimately, what we want is a statewide order. By adding the governor as a party, the State Board of Education as a party, the state superintendent as a party, and have them to come up with a plan to desegregate all of the elementary, secondary, and any other schools under the control of the State Board of Education.
The moderates and the NAACP and all of them say, shh, don't say nothing about the courts. They aren't holy men. You know, they don't hang the britches on the wall and jump in them every morning. They put them on one leg at a time, just like you and I do.
My reaction was, we're going to go to school. So we had to follow what the courts were saying and what the legal process. And thank God the legal process was that we will not let the governor or anyone else stop us from going to school because it was already in federal court.
The scariest moment that I had was not at Tuskegee Public, but here at Notasulga on our first day here when Mayor Ray came up on the bus and told us we could not go to school there because we would be violating a fire ordinance of overcrowding. And at the same time, there were state troopers who had opened the back door of the bus and started to beat on a photographer who had stepped on the bus down at Tuskegee as we came up to Notasulga. And just the fact you hear a man crying out like he was crying out because they were using cattle prods and all kinds of things on him, and then pulled him off the back of the bus, and then broke his cameras, and some of the plastic was flying around and actually, hit some of us, but no danger. Not danger. Nobody was hurt. But that was the scariest moment for me. Once Superintendent Meadows, who was the state superintendent then of schools in Alabama, decided that Tuskegee Public was not operating efficiently with 12 students and 20 teachers. So as a result, he decided for economic reasons they were going to close that school. And in closing the school, their effort was to actually force us back to Tuskegee Institute High School, which is where we had come from, which was the black school, if you will, in Macon County. Well, we went back to court with Lawyer Gray at our side, and Judge Johnson came back and said, we're not going to play musical schools. I want you to split those students up and make sure that some go to Shorter and some go to Notasulga. The three men or boys at that time were seniors, and then there were three girls, two in the 8th grade and one in the 11th grade, and said, okay, let's split them up where we can actually do 3 boys and 3 girls, in Notasulga because that was supposed to be the hot spot where most of the unlawful activity in the community would take place. And that's how we ended up in Notasulga.
There's a mysterious fire, which in reality I don't think anyone thought it was mysterious, that burned down a good portion of the school. And so those students ended up having to attend what portion of the school remained. The arsonists did not successfully burn down the entire school. I believe they burned down the cafeteria, and so students like Willie Wyatt had to continue attending that school with brown bag lunches because there's no cafeteria because it's been burned to the ground. And of course we have essentially a repeat of what happened with Tuskegee Public at those two schools, where their efforts to bar the students from coming in, court orders ultimately compel the state troopers and the county sheriffs to make way. Those students attend those schools, and then of course the white students withdraw from those schools as well. Governor Wallace and his stand in the schoolhouse door is well known. I think a lot of people don't realize that in the fall of 1963 he engaged in a spectacle that dwarfed, and not to minimize anything that happened in Tuscaloosa involving Arthur and Lucy, but it really dwarfed that in scope and scale, and that was his effort to use the state troopers, use his powers as governor through executive orders to prevent any desegregation of any public schools. And that involved in Tuskegee, of course, and those places that I mentioned earlier, Birmingham, Huntsville, and Mobile. He issues executive orders that say, I'm ordering you to close this school because desegregating the school will result in breach of the peace and result in disorder. And so I'm using my power as governor to say you must close this school.
September 2nd, 63, I believe, is the date of integration. Yes. But we went to work that night, and before the close of business on the next day, he was served with copies of papers. We got it all together, and he got on television and said, we must have been planning for a long time because we couldn't have gotten all that together that quick. And he showed the stack of papers, but we were able to do it. And he did enter an order. And then that started a series of court actions and decrees. While that started in 63 and 62 and 63, it continued until about 1967 before we finally was able to get a comprehensive state order, a state court decision in which all the elementary and secondary schools in the state, which was not then under court order, were ordered to be desegregated. And all of the institutions, the colleges and junior colleges and community colleges, and those under the control of the State Board of Education, was declared to be unconstitutional. No suit had ever been filed like that before, and none has been filed that I know of since then. But it all started because the governor interfered with and stopped and prohibited, used state power in order to keep one little school system from desegregating.
You have this nexus of individuals then involved where you have a jurist like Judge Johnson, you have an attorney like Fred Gray and his partner Solomon C., and then you have the Justice Department, Civil Rights Division, and those lawyers who have a great relationship with Judge Johnson. It was just this perfect nexus of characters, along with, of course, the students and the families who were willing to be those test cases that really made Levy-Macon what it was.
There will always be those who might not want to challenge their comfort zone, if you will. But because of Detroit Lee and Mrs. Hattie Lee and some of the other parents, we got an opportunity to challenge status quo. And we are so thankful for the likes of these parents who persevered. And we can just imagine the kind of ostracism, the kind of shunning, all sorts of things that might have happened in a small community such as Macon County that might have been leveled against these people, employment and some other things, but they persevered.
If you don't do that, what are you left with? Substandard education, substandard books, substandard lab equipment and things like that, and not a very first-rate education. When we came to school here in Notasulga, and they closed the school, at the end of the school year, the three boys, we wanted to have a graduation. When you finish high school, you want the pomp and circumstances and all of that. And we planned to have that, but they burned the school down, or that portion of the school, so we could not have a graduation that year.
People like Mr. White and Mr. Lee are literally just handed their diplomas by the principal in their office. There's no ceremony, there's no celebration, at least at the school. That would have to come from the community. And at the very same moment, you've got white students who have engaged in this exodus to this newly created segregation academy that are being celebrated, not just in a large ceremony right down the street, but in the local newspaper, and being hailed as pioneers of individual freedom, of association. It's an incredibly telling tableau, and I think very indicative of the fight that was going to he'd even just begun. I think it's very telling of that fight that had just begun at that moment, a fight of enforcement.
The last day of school, they just gave us our diploma, and we went home. But about 50 years later, we were allowed to graduate with the graduating class of that year with pomp and circumstances, cap and gown, and all of that.
How did that feel?
Very good, very good. We really, really enjoyed that.
It was joy, lots of glee for me. I got a lot of kidding and ribbing from some of my classmates from Institute High School who came over for that particular ceremony, and they said, "Hey, Willie B, after all of these years, after getting a BS degree and a master's degree and going into corporate America, you have now come back to get your high school diploma." And I said, "Yep, things have gone in a full circle for me."
What we have learned is the importance of having people on the benches, whatever level, who believe in the Constitution. We're not talking about persons who want to invoke personal feelings into their rulings. We're not talking about persons who want to pick up the newspaper and see what the editorials are reading like. We want persons who look at the Constitution and say, this is what the framers of the Constitution had in mind when they wrote the First Amendment, when they wrote the Fifth Amendment, when they wrote the 15th Amendment, the procedural aspect of the 15th Amendment due process. This is what they had in mind, and I firmly believe that's what Judge Frank M. Johnson had in the back of his mind as he made his rulings. I firmly believe that's what Judge Richard T. Reeves had in the back of his mind, and to some major degree, what Justice Harlem Grooms had in the back of his mind also.
And I look at now the impact that Lee versus Macon County Board of Education had on not only Alabama, but on the nation. And take some satisfaction in saying I had a hand in that.
I took a walk down Pico, heard someone shout. From a crowd of fed up people getting told they should calm down. Didn't wanna fight, but the tears that fill their eyes are brought by the people sworn to preserve their rights. Oh, how could you not see it all coming? Stuck in our ways and running out of time. Time to change. We've got to at least try. But what will they do when the people are stepping out of line?
I have too seen the mistakes that all of us made in years past, but I've been your governor for a long time. And I tell you that the leaders who are sitting back of me will tell you privately, I don't know about publicly, I don't ask them to, but they can tell you that Jordan Wallace's office was always open to to anyone, regardless of race or color,